Good morning, Year 6. I hope you're well and have had a good morning so far. Today in our reading lesson, we're going to be thinking about Chapter 8 of Private Peaceful, and we're going to be trying to retrieve information, so to pull information from the text. As part of that, we're going to identify what a question is asking us to do. We're going to locate the key words within that question in an effort to support ourselves in solving what is being necessitated. We're going to scan the text and locate potential key passages within that text, and we're going to then support our answer with evidence from potentially even a direct quotation from the text. Okay. A bit of recall to begin with. True or falses? True or falses today. So just shout out your answers once we've gone through the four statements, please. So Molly has married Charlie. Charlie was forced to join the army. Tommy chose to join the army, and finally, Mrs. Peaceful was happy about her boys going off to fight. So, what do we think? First one, Molly has married Charlie is true. Lovely job. Yeah, it's true. Well done if you managed to remember that. Remember, it was that quite sparse ceremony. It was conducted within the church, but they wouldn't let them ring the bells. I think it was punishment because of the fact that Molly had become pregnant before being engaged. And the Wolf woman described it as a marriage in sin, didn't she? Grandma Wolf. She wasn't very happy about it. Charlie was forced to join the army. He was forced because the colonel threatened to evict his family and to sack Molly unless the family were going to allow Charlie to join up. What about Tommy, though? Tommy chose, didn't he? He decided that he wanted to. There's many motivations for him, weren't there? He wanted to be a man. He wanted to grow up because I think he perceived that that would change how Molly viewed him. But he also felt inspired when he saw those soldiers in town. Not necessarily inspired to be one of them, but inspired to not be called a coward. If you remember that old woman there calling a coward, he felt quite upset about that. So he's both inspired to be like some soldiers, but also particularly unwilling to be called a coward. Mrs. Peaceful, she was not happy. She was unhappy about it. She was really upset about it as they went off on the train through towards Exeter. Okay. Right, guys, a bit of vocabulary recall from the previous session. So we've got khaki, plunge, whiz bang, bellowed, privy, and shovel. Now, privy, shovel, whiz bang, plunge, and khaki we looked at in the previous session, and we've got some definitions for those. Bellowed we didn't, but we did mention when somebody bellowed. I think it was Sergeant Hanley was doing some bellowing, wasn't it? So I'd like you to write your own definition for bellowed, but for the other 5 words, all you need to do is write the word in the correct slot next to the definition. So which of these is a toilet? Which of these is a strong cotton and wool fabric? Which of these is a tool? Which of these means to push or thrust quickly, and which of these is a small caliber high velocity shell? So we'll write those correct terminologies in each section, please. Right, guys, on to today's reading then. We're thinking today about a bit of vocabulary teaching as we look through, and you can complete these as well. But we're thinking about carrying on within this chapter. Now, earlier in the chapter, we'd seen that the soldiers were told they should dig deep because they'd avoid those whiz bangs, those small caliber shells that might attack them. No matter what the officers and the NCOs told us of the hardships and dangers of trench warfare, we all believed we were simply in some kind of rehearsal. So this idea that they don't quite believe that they're actually in the army, that they could be at risk. It feels like a game to them, don't they? They kept talking about it being a game and not real. These NCOs are non-commissioned officers, so that means that they're not the grand officers, but the NCOs are officers who are basically the people who are in charge of them. Okay, they're the soldiers who are in charge. They were junior soldiers before, and they got gradually promoted to the point where they're now the corporal or the sergeant. The opposite to NCOs are officers. Now, some people join the army just as officers. Okay, so they come in straight away, maybe because of how smart they are, maybe because of the school they went to. Lots of reasons why they might become officers straight away rather than going in as juniors. No matter what the officers and the NCOs, so these are non-commissioned officers, told us of the hardships and the dangers of trench warfare, we still all believed we were simply in some kind of rehearsal, acting costume. We had to play our part, dress our part, but in the end, it would only be a play. That was what we tried to believe. And if we ever spoke about it, that was because normally it sounds like they're not talking to one another about their fears, about their concerns. It's almost something they've wrapped up, they've not shared, they've not experienced with one another. But the truth was that we didn't speak of it much. I think we didn't dare because deep down we all knew and we all trembled, and we were trying to deny it or disguise it or both. I remember we were on exercise in the hill, lying there on our backs in the sunshine one morning, when Pete sat up and suddenly said, "Hear that?" he said. "It's guns from over in France. Real guns." We sat up and listened. We heard it. Some said it was distant thunder, but we heard it all right. We saw the sudden fear in each other's eyes and knew for what it was. So they hadn't talked about it before, but at the point where they could hear it, they couldn't pretend it was a game anymore. Although there's 20, 25 miles of sea between England and France, the sound waves of the guns and the artillery and the shells were sufficiently loud that it travelled. But that same afternoon, we were back to play acting, war games in full pack, attacking some very distant enemy cops. When the whistles blew, we climbed out of our trenches, walked forward, bayonets fixed. Then, on a bellowed command, we threw ourselves face down and crawled on through the long grass. The ground under us was still warm with summer, and there were buttercups. I thought of Molly then, and Charlie and the buttercups. Always goes back to Charlie and Molly, doesn't it? These recollections. For our narrator. Now, if we look on page 110, we are looking for a piece of language that means the same as shook and quivered. Okay, and I'll give you a couple of options. Is it trembled or is it play acting? Okay, the correct synonym there, the correct word is trembled. And what I'd like you to do on your packet is to fill in the other sections for where trembled appeared on page 110, please. Okay, page 111, we're going to carry on with it. So remember, he's being reminded of the buttercups in the meadows, water meadows back home. Water meadows are a type of field where water tends to flood on those type of fields. A bee, heavy with pollen and still greedy for more, clover hopped in front of me as I crawled. I remember I spoke to him. "We're much alike, bee, you and me," he said. I said, "You may carry your pack underneath you, and your rifle may stick out of your bottom. But you and me, bee, are much alike." The bee must have taken offence at this because he took off and flew away. I lay where I was, propped up on my elbows, and watched him go until my thoughts were rudely interrupted by the corporal. "What do you think you're on, peaceful up picnic? On your feet!" So he had a moment where he forgot that he was being a soldier, and then the corporal came and really told him he had to not forget. In those first few weeks in uniform, I hardly had time to miss anyone, not even Molly, though I thought of her often, and Mother and Big Joe. But they were only ever fleeting thoughts. Charlie and I rarely talked of home. We were hardly ever alone together anyway. We'd even stopped cursing the colonel by now. There didn't seem any point, not anymore. It was a hateful thing he'd done, but it was a done thing. So although he'd done this awful thing with Bertha, although he'd done this awful thing really by sending Charlie away, it it was a bad thing, but it's done. So there's nothing they can change about it now. It's not. We were soldiers now, and it wasn't bad so far. So far. So far. As I read that, I noticed so far. Remember, our narrator is viewing things from a further point in the future. So do things get worse? I think they probably do. In fact, despite all the lining up and the bellowing, it was turning out to be a lark, a real lark. Charlie and I wrote some letters home. Most of his were to Molly, all of mine to Mother and Big Joe. We read them aloud to each other, those bits we wanted to share anyway. We weren't allowed to say where we were or anything about the training. Why do you think that would be? Why would they not be allowed to tell people? They might be worried that people would find out, and therefore they could attack. If the Triple Alliance found out where the soldiers' base was, they could attack. Okay, guys, just having a look on this page and swearing. What's the synonym for swearing on this page? Is it thought or is it crawled? I've managed to highlight neither of those. Sorry, it's cursing. Okay, so cursing is on that page. So if you remember the cursing the colonel now, swearing about the colonel now. Sorry, guys, my highlighting was all wrong there, wasn't it? Okay, so again, can you fill in the sections related to cursing on that page? We weren't allowed to say where we were or anything about the training. We always found plenty to tell them, plenty to brag about, plenty to ask about. We told them the truth that we were having a good time, eating well and being good, mostly. But the moment we got on the ship to France, the good times ended. Little Les James said he smelled a storm in the air. As usual, he was right. So things change. They've stopped training now. They're on the ship to France. Les James, remember, he had this capacity to smell if the weather was going to change, and he could, and he did, and he said it was going to. There wasn't a man on board that ship that didn't want to die before he ever got to France. As a line, that really punches, isn't it? It's not the war that they're scared of. It's not how bad things get. It's the sea travel. It's awful. Most of us, Charlie and me included, had never seen the sea before, much less the heaving grey waves of the English Channel. And we lurched about the deck, which means to wobble, to sway, and to not be able to stand stably. And we lurched about the deck like drunken ghosts longing only to be released from our agony. Charlie and I were vomiting over the side when a seaman came up to us, clapped us heartily on the back, and told us that if we were going to die, we'd feel much better doing it down below in the hole with the horses. So Charlie and I staggered down the gangways until we found ourselves deep in the bowels of the ship, which means deep down in the ship, and in amongst the terrified horses who seemed happy. Who seemed happy to have someone for company as we crawled in and curled up in their straw, too close to their hooves for safety, but feeling too ill to care. The seaman was right. Deep down here, the ship seemed to roll much less, and despite the stifling stench of the oil and the hurt horse dung, we began to feel better almost at once. So on this page, the piece of vocabulary we're looking for is a synonym for enthusiastically. Do we think that's going to be heartily, or do we think it's mostly? We know that mostly doesn't mean enthusiastically, so heartily is it is. Yeah, so heartily. So can you try and use heartily in a sentence and try and complete that section for heartily, please? And finally, on to page 113. The first time the French girl that hovered overhead eyeing me with deep suspicion looked much like every girl I'd been seen following the plough back at home. Every voice I heard on the quayside below was English. So it all feels like it's English. Every voice I heard on the quayside below was English. Every uniform and helmet was like our own. Then, as we came down the gangplank into the fresh morning air, we saw them. Lines of walking wounded, shuffling along the quay towards us. Some with their eyes bandaged, holding on to the shoulder of the one in front. Others lay on stretchers. One of them, puffing on a cigarette between pale, parched lips, looked up at me out of sunken yellow eyes. "Good luck, lads," he cried as we passed. "Give 'em what for?" So the soldier who's coming back, who's injured, who's hurt, wishes these new soldiers good luck. Give them what for means to attack the enemy, hurt them. The rest stayed silent, and their staring silence spoke to each of us as we formed up and marched out of town. If you remember Wilfred Owen, that poet, and how he'd experienced shell shock, this idea of them staying silent and their staring silence speaking to each of us. That's the idea that they've been affected by war such that they don't feel that they want to inspire the others to go and fight. They just want to get home. They feel so sad. We all knew then that the larking and the play acting were over. From that moment, none of us doubted the seriousness of what was about to be. It was our lives we would be acting out over here, and for many of us, our deaths. If any of us had any last lingering delusions, then they were very soon dispelled by our first sight of the vast training camp at Tapple. The camp stretched away as far as the eye could see, a tented city, and everywhere I looked there were soldiers drilling. Drilling means to practice. Marching, doubling, crawling, wheeling, saluting, presenting arms. I had never in my life, presenting arms means to hold their weapons. I had never in my life seen such a bustle of people, never heard such a racket of humanity. A racket of humanity, so it's so loud because of how many people are there. Remember, Charlie and Tom are from a rural village. The air echoed with the din of barked orders and shrieked obscenities. So on this page, the piece of language is that word which means injured. And do we think that's lingering delusions or walking wounded? Well, if you think about if you're injured, you would then continue to walk if you could, but you would walk while wounded. And people who are injured are described as the walked in wounded. So can you try and utilise that in that page, please, in that section? Right, guys, you've got your vocabulary, 2 sections today, the matching the language and the book quote section. And then we've got some retrieval work to do. And with the retrieval work then today, we've got to, according to the text, were the soldiers on their own? Well, what do you think? Clear that the soldiers were with other men. If we look at this section, we can see we've got the word we there, okay, and that tells me that there's more than one person, okay. The author using the word we to describe the experience shows there were multiple soldiers. I can do better than that. I can look at this section as well. These low lines of toilets, okay. So furthermore, the lack of privacy shows that many soldiers were present. If you could go to the toilets that are privy on your own, it would mean there weren't many people around. But because lots of people